Stand on a ridge in southern France 20,000 years ago. Somebody beside you points at a smudge on the far slope and says, "Reindeer, maybe 40 of them." You look. You see a gray hillside and nothing on it. Everyone around you has already picked up their spears and started walking. Roughly a third of adults alive today are nearsighted. In the Ice Age, the best guess is that almost nobody was. That is a strange thing to be nearly certain about. Myopia is mostly a shape problem. The eyeball grows slightly too long, so light from far away comes to a focus in front of the retina instead of on it. Distance goes soft. Close-up stays sharp. Today that means glasses and a mild annoyance at the back of a lecture hall. In a foraging life, it means something else. At about 2.5 diopters of myopia, a reindeer standing at 400 yards is just a rock that might be a rock. You would lose the weather, too. Much of reading a sky is noticing thin changes at the edge of the world, hours before they arrive over you, and you would lose faces. Knowing whether the group coming along the river is your cousins or strangers is not a small piece of information. So it is tempting to conclude that nearsighted people simply could not survive out there. Hold that thought, because I think it is wrong, and we will come back to it. First, the obvious problem. Eyes do not fossilize. An eye socket tells you almost nothing about the length of the eyeball that sat inside it. So everything we think we know comes from living people. And the sharpest evidence came from a place with a lot of horizon, and suddenly, a lot of schooling. In the 1960s, optometrist Francis Young and his colleagues examined Inuit families in and around Barrow, Alaska. They tested parents, grandparents, and children in the same households. The older generation had grown up hunting on sea ice with little or no formal schooling. Among them, nearsightedness was rare, only a few percent. Their children had been through compulsory American-style schooling, indoors, at desks. In that generation, myopia was common, running to half of the young people and beyond. Same families, same genes, one generation apart. Whatever changed was not ancestry, it was childhood. The results were published in 1969. The pattern shows up again and again. Surveys in remote communities without long formal schooling tend to find myopia in a few percent of people, sometimes less. The other end of the scale is startling. A study of 19-year-old male conscripts in Seoul, published in 2012, found about 96% of them were myopic. That is one of the fastest changes to the human body we can actually document, and it is not evolution. Something about modern growing up is bending eyeballs. For a long time, the assumed villain was reading. Books, close work, eye strain. It turns out reading is probably not the main thing. In 2008, Catherine Rose, Ian Morgan, and colleagues compared children of Chinese descent growing up in Sydney and in Singapore. Similar ancestry, similar academic pressure, very different results. In Sydney, about 3% were myopic. In Singapore, close to 30%. The strongest difference was hours spent outdoors, roughly 14 a week against about 3. How much the children read did not explain the gap. Time outside did. That flipped the question from what the eye is looking at to what the eye is standing in. The leading guess is light intensity. Full outdoor daylight is tens of thousands of lux. A well-lit classroom is a few hundred. Your eye can barely tell, but its growth signals can. Animal work supports it. Reagan Ashby and Frank Scheffel, working with chicks in 2009, found bright light slowed experimentally induced myopia. Retinal dopamine is the suspected messenger. Researchers still argue about the details. And there is a trial. In Guangzhou, Hemming Guang and colleagues added 40 minutes of outdoor time to the school day for 3 years. New cases of myopia dropped modestly but measurably. This is research on how children's eyes grow, not a treatment for anyone's vision. If your sight is changing, that is a conversation for an optometrist, not for a video about the Ice Age. Now put an Ice Age child into that picture. Outdoors from waking to dark, almost no sustained close work before adolescence, and a horizon in every direction. That is close to the ideal conditions for an eye to stop growing at the right length. Which raises the sharper question. Was myopia actually zero? Almost certainly not. Myopia is partly heritable, and genome studies have found hundreds of variants linked to refractive error. Those variants are ancient. They were in Pleistocene bodies too, and some myopia is barely environmental at all. High myopia present from early childhood turns up in populations with no schooling and no books. Some people are simply built that way. So in a band of 30 people, across a lifetime, somebody was born who could not resolve the far slope. The real question is what happened to them. This is where the story gets more interesting than I expected, because Ice Age work was not all horizon scanning. An enormous amount of it happened at arm's length or closer. Take Sungir in Russia, near Vladimir. Excavations from 1955 under Otto Bader uncovered burials roughly 34,000 years old, buried under thousands of carved mammoth ivory beads. One adult was laid out with around 3,000 beads. 2 children buried nearby had more. Every one of them shaped and drilled by hand. Randall White has spent years replicating this kind of ornament. Making one ivory bead takes something like an hour of concentrated work. That burial represents thousands of hours of close focus. Then there are the eyed needles. From Denisova Cave to Ice Age Europe, bone needles survive with eyes under a millimetre across, threaded by someone, often by firelight. So the tidy story writes itself. The nearsighted became the engravers, the bead drillers, the needle threaders. The band found them a job. Everybody wins. I want that to be true. I do not think we can test it. Nothing in the archaeological record connects a particular person's eyesight to a particular tool in their hand. What I think the evidence does support is milder and honestly more useful. Blurred distance vision in a foraging band was a limitation, not a disqualification, because there was real work at close range. Mild myopia is not purely a loss either. An eye that focuses by default at arm's length is genuinely excellent at arm's length, for decades longer than most. But that argument still rests on an assumption. Did Ice Age groups actually carry people who could not do the standard jobs? For that, we have a body. Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, dug by Ralph Selecki in the 1950s. Shanidar 1 was a Neanderthal man who died in his 40s, roughly 45,000 years ago. The left side of his face had been crushed by a heavy blow. Eric Trinkus's reading of the injury is that he was probably blind in that eye. There was more. A withered right arm, useless or lost below the elbow, a healed skull fracture, arthritis, bony growths in both ear canals that likely left him hard of hearing. Every one of those injuries had healed. He lived years after them. Somebody brought him food. Somebody kept him with the group. Somebody waited for him. Penny Spikins has argued that this kind of care was ordinary rather than remarkable. How far you can push that inference is genuinely contested. The healed bone is not. And that reframes the whole question. A group that can carry a half-blind, one-armed, partly deaf man for a decade is not going to be undone by someone who cannot see the far ridge. So here is the honest limit. We cannot diagnose a single Ice Age person. The argument is entirely inference, from living populations and from what modern childhoods do to growing eyes. But the direction of the evidence is hard to escape. Sharp distance vision looks like the ordinary human condition, maintained by years of childhood spent in bright outdoor light. Which means when you reach for your glasses in the morning, you are touching something new. Not a flaw in your body, but your body answering a world we built very recently. I keep coming back to that ridge and the smudge on the far slope, and how many people alive today would simply never have seen it.